Tractate Chullin covers the various complex laws of kosher and the proper slaughter of animals. Chapter 1 begins on the laws of slaughtering an animal. The first Mishnah says, anybody can validly slaughter an animal besides for a deaf-mute, an insane person, or a minor, out of concern that they might mess up the act of slaughter. They would be allowed to do so if somebody is watching them. The Gemara debates based on the wording as to if anybody's slaughter is permitted initially or only after the fact. For instance, in a later tractate, Timura, it says all can substitute animals for consecrated ones using similar wording, but that's different, as later in that Mishnah, it specifically qualifies it's only valid after the fact. There's also the later Mishnah that all can declare an erech vow. There too it concludes that it's only permissible after the fact, so it said the expression all can do something could really mean either way, depending on the context. The issue here is that our Mishnah afterwards said their slaughter is valid, as a clarification of a sort, implying it would only be permissible after the fact. So there are a few different answers. The first is that this unique wording is to teach that all can slaughter animals prepared at the same level of consecrated food, even an impure person, so long as he's very careful to not touch the animal. This could be possible if he uses a long knife, for instance. However, as mentioned, this isn't preferable and would only be valid after the fact. Then, when the Mishnah said that a mentally incompetent person could not slaughter an animal, that means they can't at all, even after, in case they mess up the procedure. As for the impure person, he would need to state that he hadn't touched the animal, but if he is not there to be asked, as mentioned at the end of the Mishnah, we would need people who watched him to testify to this. There's a related principle on this discussed earlier in Tractate Zivachim. As for the type of impurity being discussed in this case, it has to be where the person was impure from a sheretz creature as opposed to a corpse, as otherwise he just make the knife itself impure and then the meat impure. That's one explanation. A second explanation is that it meant all can slaughter, including a Kuthian, so long as somebody's watching him. If he's unmonitored, we check to see if he'd eat any of the meat himself as to whether it's allowed. Then when the Mishnah said that a mentally incompetent person couldn't slaughter an animal, that meant that they can't at all, even after, in case they mess up the procedure. But then, what does the last part refer to about them being monitored, as we already brought that by the case of the Kuthian. So there are other posed issues in addition to this from earlier discussions in Tractate of Avodah Zarah. We know that if somebody is being monitored intermittently, walking in and out of the room, they can be relied on in the first place. So this is apparently contradictory, so we bring the third explanation. It means all can slaughter, even a Kuthian, where he's being monitored intermittently. But if somebody finds he's already slaughtered the animal, we check to see if he'll eat it. Then, when the Mishnah said that a mentally incompetent person couldn't slaughter an animal, that meant that they can't do so at all, even after, in case they mess up the procedure. But then again, what does the last part refer to about them being monitored, as we already brought that by the Kuthian? So, a fourth explanation, it means all can slaughter, even a renegade, which is somebody who habitually violates certain commandments here of eating improperly slaughtered animals out of desire. Now, that would be permissible if you gave him a pre-examined knife, but if you just find he slaughtered the animal, you should examine the knife afterwards, and if it's fine with no nicks, which would have made it impermissible, it's permitted. Again, the prohibitions by a mentally incompetent person here are in case they mess up the slaughter. But then what does the last part refer to about them being monitored? As apparently just checking the knife is an option. So a fifth explanation, what I meant was all can slaughter if they're proficient in the laws of slaughter, meaning they can recite the relevant laws and are not just established at being skilled. If they didn't recite the laws and they slaughtered an animal after the fact, we test to see if they can recite the laws to see if it'll be allowed. Again, mentally incompetent people are disallowed. But then what does the last part refer to about them being monitored? As apparently we can just test their knowledge. So a sixth final explanation, it means all can slaughter an animal if they're established as skilled, which is done by properly slaughtering 2 or 3 times in our presence. If he hadn't done this and slaughtered an animal and then testifies that he hadn't fainted or something, it's valid after the fact. Mentally incompetent people are banned from this as mentioned. Then when it mentions the man being monitored, that specifically applied to a case where the man isn't available to testify that he hadn't fainted. It explains why each of them disagrees with the other opinions. By the first opinion, it's that some disagree with the premise and say that an ordinary animal just isn't treated with the same status as a consecrated animal. Then people who disagree with the final explanations is that they hold anybody slaughtering an animal is presumed to be proficient, and that there's no concern of fainting. Regarding the opinion that by the case of a Kuthian, that was as mentioned, that others disagree, as they say an intermittent guardian is sufficient, and so on, as there's certain linguistic issues with the remaining cases. Related, we said that a Kuthian is believed to have slaughtered properly if he's monitored, or if he's willing to eat of the animal. I quote sources for this. It said this applies to a string of birds too, having the man eat one of the birds, and there's no concern of that specific bird he chose being the one that was slaughtered properly, as they were mixed up and any potential identifying marks were removed. This is all essentially based on a dispute regarding the people of ancient Samaria, as mentioned, the Kuthians, who kept the laws of the Torah, but were not always so reliable in matters not explicitly stated within the Torah. However, it is stated, if the Kuthians had established a practice amongst themselves, they would end up being far more meticulous in it than the rest of the Jewish people. So there's a dispute if the Kuthians were reliable by something not explicitly stated in the Torah, but that was established amongst themselves. Regarding the case of the renegade, who frequently ate improperly slaughtered food, the reason it's permitted for him to slaughter, if his knife is examined, is as he may as well properly slaughter the animal there as opposed to doing it improperly as his knife is proper. It's just that he wouldn't go out of his way to fetch a new knife if his current one was impermissible. I'll quote a number of sources for this principle. It's also said, if somebody is a renegade in regards to frequently committing idolatry, it's still allowed to eat of animals he slaughtered, which is seen in some cases in scripture, wherein Yehoshaphat ate meat prepared by Achav. That's discussed, explaining particularities of the case. This goes further and it quotes additional sources for this principle. However, it is disproven, as from a related case regarding idolatrous libations. It proves that somebody who's a renegade to commit idolatry is assumed to be a renegade against the entire Torah. It quotes further locations where this is sourced. It also explains the actual voting on the case as to whether the slaughtering of Kuthians was permitted. This is additionally discussed, quoting some relevant verses. It's said that the Kuthians were at one point given the status as complete idol worshippers in regards to courtyard ownership rights due to their frequent practice of idolatry. It cites related points as to whether there's concern when eating food prepared by an ignoramus of a lack of tithing or other kosher issues. Incidents on this topic are quoted demonstrating the concept that if somebody is righteous, they won't come to even accidentally eat forbidden food. It additionally discusses this in some particular cities as to whether they have this particular concern of a lack of tithing within them, along with some additional incidents. That's for the discussion and some related points, saying that the righteous, when dead, are even greater than when they were alive, as seen by certain prophets like Elijah. It's also said that no illness or affliction, not even sorcery, can harm somebody who God hasn't decreed punishment against. Again, incidents demonstrating this are quoted. A related rule about the laws of slaughter: if somebody superheated a knife and slaughtered with it, it's still valid, as its sharpness precedes the heat, and the sides of the knife don't burn anything as the incision spreads apart with the knife. This has relevance if somebody struck somebody with a heated piece of metal and a leprosy wound developed there as to whether this constitutes an inflammation or a burn. There's a difference, as these two variants don't combine to form the minimum size to affect impurity. It additionally expands on this list regarding laws of leprosy. It said it's different than our knife case, as it's a blunt object here, not a knife, so it remains unresolved. Regarding a knife used for idolatry, it's said it's permissible to slaughter with it, as it damages an animal, but it cannot be used to cut meat, which causes an actual improvement. So slaughtering an animal with an idolatrous knife would be forbidden if the animal is dangerously sick, as that's an improvement, and you can cut meat with such a knife if you're ruining a particular cut of meat. Also, this only applies if the knife was never used on actual non-kosher meats, which it could then absorb, meaning it was only used to cut wood or something, or it was used on non-kosher meats, but it was made kosher and cleansed by being purged. Somewhat similarly, if somebody slaughters using a knife owned by a non-Jewish person, some say out of concern the knife absorbed non-kosher food, that the parts that came in contact with the knife must be cut off. Others say it could just be washed off. This dispute is either based on whether absorption will occur, or possibly not, as the pipes are expelling blood, so it won't be able to absorb anything. Alternatively, it's a debate as to whether absorption will occur due to the pressure of the knife. Related, if a knife was used to slaughter an animal with a fatal physical defect, it's said it's enough to just wash it in cold water, or even to just wipe it down. This is as the animal was kosher, it's just impermissible due to the defect, which is only viewed after the slaughter. Related, a butcher needs 3 separate knives, one for slaughter, one to cut meat, and one to cut out forbidden fats. Technically, you could just have 2 and cut forbidden fats last, but 3 were instituted to prevent any mistakes, meaning the knives must also have individual identifying marks. Similarly, a butcher must also have 2 separate vessels of water, one to wash meats and one for forbidden fats, both with identifying marks for the same reason. It's also said that a flank of meat with attached forbidden fat shouldn't be held above other meats in case the fats drip down and become absorbed. This doesn't apply to the actual meat it's attached to, as it's separated by a membrane, unlike the lower piece which had the membrane rubbed off. It's also said a Torah scholar must learn 3 things: writing, slaughter, and circumcision. Some add how to tie tefillin, how to say the wedding blessings, and how to tie tzitzis, although those were more common. Also, if somebody frequently slaughtered properly, but it's found that he doesn't know the laws of slaughter, which will be expounded on more later, you cannot eat from him. It's also said that a butcher must inspect the trachea and esophagus after slaughter to make sure he did it properly, which it sources. If this isn't done, it's a debate as to what status of non-kosher the animal has. This is qualified. Some hold an animal is presumed to be forbidden until it's confirmed that the animal was slaughtered properly. There are additional points on this. It also brings up a related prohibition that you shouldn't drink water that was left out overnight due to some safety concerns. Now, if somebody slaughtered using a knife and afterwards much later realized that his knife has a nick, then that much earlier slaughter is invalid, even if between then he was using the knife to crush bones, which presumably caused the nick. Others disagree and say the slaughter is fine, as we assume it got nicked from the crushing of the bones, so it's an uncertainty which doesn't change the thing's status. It debates this from other cases. Although it is ruled if somebody wasn't breaking bones with a knife in between slaughter, we assume the knife was nicked by the slaughter, and it's invalid, and if there were bones broken in between, we assume that's what caused the nick, and the slaughter is valid. It quotes related cases. It's also said some require a knife to be inspected in between every slaughter of every animal, and it argues who this is in accordance with. It also quotes sources of the principle that, unless proven otherwise, a status is presumed to remain unchanged. While we're here, it also quotes the source for the concept that we follow majority, even if it's not directly in front of us. It quotes a number of opinions, which are discussed. Further sources for this concept are quoted. Anyways, if somebody is monitoring another man's slaughter of the animal, he needs to watch him from beginning to end. This applies if the slaughterer isn't knowledgeable in the laws of slaughter, so it's saying, even if you witness the man sever the first pipe properly, you still can't presume he'll do the second pipe properly too. Related, it said if somebody sends an agent to slaughter his animal and then goes and finds that it was slaughtered, he can assume it was done properly. However, then he says that if somebody sends an agent to separate his tithes and then finds his tithes have been separated, he cannot assume it was done properly. So let's explain the differences. The concern is that somebody else, instead of the agent, slaughtered the animal or separated the produce first, and it's only by slaughtering of animals that we assume most people that do this act know what they're doing. Although the same principle that most people who slaughter animals are assumed to be proficient is actually a disputed point. Anyways, we had stated that everybody can slaughter animals besides for mentally incompetent people, so deaf mutes, insane people, or minors. Based on the choice of wording, it said that they're prohibited from doing this even while supervised in the first place. Then we said that if they did wind up slaughtering the animal, but they were monitored and they did everything properly, it's valid. Evidently, this opinion rejects the concept that there's a requirement to have specific intents while slaughtering an animal. Besides for this, though, the slaughter must have been done properly. Although related, it's a debate if a minor is even capable of having legally significant thought or action. It's debated, and it concludes that minors can perform a legally significant act biblically, but not rabbinically. Regarding a minor's thought that are evident from his actions, biblically this has no significance, but rabbinically it does. It quotes the source from scripture for the point that the slaughter of an animal requires proper intent. New Mishnah. If a non-Jewish person slaughtered an animal, we assume it wasn't done properly in accordance with the laws of kosher, and the animal could also convey impurity. The Gemara says this implies that an animal slaughtered by a non-Jewish person could still be benefited from, although others say that if a pagan worshipper slaughtered an animal, we automatically assume it was done for idolatry and cannot be used. Anyways, it also tries to derive that an animal slaughtered by an idolatrous priest is assumed to be used for idolatry and therefore prohibited from benefit. It expands on the list of things forbidden from such a person. Although it is stated that most non-Jewish people don't have this status, some even say that none of them did, and some say that most of the people committing idolatry out in the world in this time period weren't doing so because they really believed in it, they just were doing so out of tradition. Although it does say that we fully accept vow and gift offerings towards the temple equally, whether they were from Jewish people or non-Jewish people. It also explains the point on the animal's impurity contamination. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughtered an animal at night, or if a blind person slaughtered an animal, it's valid. The Gemara says this is only valid after the fact, and it should not be done initially, although slaughter at night is fine if there's a torch to see by. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, there's a liability of capital punishment for doing this. However, the slaughter was still valid. The Gemara says, nevertheless, the meat cannot be eaten until the Shabbos is over, due to issues of it being prepared at the wrong time. It additionally discusses the logic of this principle. It further argues sources on this as to why exactly this meat is prohibited over Shabbos. It additionally describes alternative sources for this principle. Related incidents on this topic are quoted. It does say, unlike slaughtering on Shabbos, cooking food on Shabbos, while also forbidden, is treated differently. So if somebody slaughtered an animal on Shabbos for a very sick person, which is allowed, a healthy person can chew the meat while it's raw, as there's nothing extra being made for him. But if somebody cooks food on Shabbos for a very sick man, a healthy person cannot have any, in case anything extra got prepared for him. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal using the blade of a sickle, flint, or with a sharpened reed, it's valid. All are slaughtered. We always slaughter, and we slaughter anything. That's an expression that's going to be explained soon. Besides for a serrated harvesting sickle, a saw, animal teeth, or a nail, as those tear as opposed to cut. Essentially, a proper knife for slaughter cannot have any serration on it whatsoever. The Gemara debates as to if this implies that using a sickle blade, flint, or sharp reed is permissible only after the fact. Not initially. It discusses this from a number of cases. Related, it said that it is valid to slaughter using a wheel mechanism contraption as long as it's operated manually and not through hydraulic force. Alternatively, it's just invalid to use a secondary force. Anyways, it additionally debates whether a knife attached to the ground is permissible, along with related discussion on items, if they're considered attached or detached, and how that relates to some laws of impurity. So, if something was originally detached from the ground and then became attached, it debates this from several cases. For instance, it said if a knife is embedded into a wall and used to slaughter, it's valid, although only if the animal was below the knife, as there can't be a pressing force in slaughter, only a cutting action. It's also said that slaughter using a reed stem is prohibited, among other actions, although it is said to be dependent on the type of reed. When the Mishnah said all are slaughtered, that means all animals and birds must be slaughtered. When it said we always slaughter, that means even in exile, meat is permitted only if the animal is slaughtered properly. There's slight variation on this last one as to if before exile, when the Jewish people were wandering in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, whether meat was permitted at all or if it required proper slaughter. These principles are debated from a number of sources. Some suggest that proper slaughter of animals wasn't even required prior to entering the land of Israel. Regarding animals that were killed prior to entering Israel and were then kept around until after the conquering, it's unresolved if those were allowed to be eaten. When the Mishnah said we slaughter with anything, that's disputed. Some reinterpret the whole quote and say all may slaughter, as mentioned twice, includes a Kuthian and a renegade. Then it said we always slaughter, that meant by day or by night, and even on top of a roof or a boat. And then when it said we slaughter with anything, that referred to with flint, glass, or a reed stem. Regarding the sickle or saw, it describes the serrations and notches and explains how they're impermissible or possibly not, depending on the shape of the notch. Essentially, it said if somebody runs their fingernail along the blade to check, and there's a notch with 2 points, like a V, like this, it's invalid, as is any slaughter done with it. If the notch is only in one direction, meaning it's a gradual slope, and then drops to a sharp point, it shouldn't be used initially, but if it was used, it's valid, although only if it's moved in one direction without being pulled towards the serrated bit. If the notch is a gradual slope in both directions, it's valid even initially. It also sources the principle that a knife for slaughter must be checked before use. It describes methods of this, some saying it must be lightly tested against your flesh and nail to ensure its sharpness and lack of edge, and some say this is required on all 3 sides of the blade. Others say testing all 3 sides isn't required. As mentioned, by superheating a knife, the flesh spreads out as it cuts. On the topic of notches, there are other types of notches that have legal significance besides for a slaughtering knife that will create prohibitions. Notches in the bone of a paschal offering, in the ear of a firstborn animal, and as a blemish on a sacrificial animal. The size of these notches to be significant, it must be equal to the same size as a notch in the stones of the altar that would create an invalidation within. This is a notch large enough that it would stop a fingernail passing by it. It was said that a slaughterer must submit his knife to the sages to ensure that it didn't have any disqualifying nicks, and it's said if somebody doesn't do this, he has a ban placed on him. Others say if this occurs and his knife is found to be flawed, he's fired, and we say his meat is non-kosher. Others say we're harsher and we destroy his meat so he cannot sell it to anybody, even to a non-Jewish person. It quotes incidents of this. Unlike a single tooth or an attached nail, which we said are impermissible for slaughter, it said 2 detached teeth or a detached nail are permissible even in the first place. New Mishnah. If somebody is slaughtered using a serrated harvesting sickle in only one direction, Beis Hillel says it's valid, Beis Shammai disagrees. If it was filed down to be smooth, it's treated like a knife. The Gemara says possibly when Beis Hillel says it was allowed, they only meant that it didn't give off impurity. It still couldn't be eaten from though. This is debated from some sources. New Mishnah. Now on the actual locations of slaughter, essentially the pipes that must be cut are the trachea and esophagus. However, there is a certain limit as to where you can cut until, and if you go past this, the slaughter is invalid. You're supposed to sever right through the trachea. However, somebody tilted the knife slightly and wound up finishing the cut slightly above the cricoid cartilage. Is a debate. Some say it's invalid, others say it's fine, as majority was done through the trachea. The Gemara says we hold like this latter opinion, although it would be invalid if any of the lower cartilage rings were severed, as only this cricoid cartilage entirely surrounds the trachea. Others dispute this and say that would be a valid location for slaughter, although it's ruled to be impermissible. Related cases of this are cited. Anyways, it's argued as to if cutting through the actual thyroid cartilage is valid, or if that's too far. If the corniculate cartilage was severed, it's a debate if that makes the animal invalid. It's ruled from the point where the thyroid cartilage curves upward and down is valid, and if the corniculate cartilage was severed, it would also be valid. The basis for this is cited. Regarding the debate as to if cutting slightly above the cricoid cartilage would invalidate the slaughter of an animal, this dispute is defined as cutting through 2/3 of the trachea properly and then the last third above it, essentially debating as to whether it's sufficient. If the cut is through less of the trachea than this, it's agreed to be invalid. Others actually define the case as the opposite, that the first third was too high and the last 2/3 properly went through the trachea, essentially debating as to whether if the first part of the laceration was made in the wrong place, if it can be adjusted properly. They would agree if the last third shifted too far upwards, it's valid. There's variation on this quoted dispute. Now, if somebody made a cut a third too high up, then a third properly, and then the last third went too high up, it's a debate if it's kosher or not. The debate is, as some say, the part in the middle was proper, and that's what actually killed the animal. The other opinion says majority of the cut needs to be done properly. If a third was cut properly, a third was too high, and a third was proper, it was also debated if this is valid or not. Further on in this case, where the middle part of the cut was too high above the trachea, there are additional opinions as to whether or not this is valid. Some would rule that if only the middle is within the right area, it's valid. They also say if there's a tear halfway through the trachea, the slaughterer can finish the cut and it would be valid. If the pre-existing tear was in the back of the trachea, it's said to be invalid to cut until you reach it. The logic is that it's comparable to an act of slaughter that was finished by somebody who is not allowed to slaughter animals, but others dispute this comparison, saying there's no difference from the former case, where it's the other way around. New Mishnah. Unlike typical methods of slaughter, specifically by temple bird offerings, they were not slaughtered with a knife, but rather through a process called milika, which involved a Kohen pressing his thumbnail through the neck of the bird. Slaughter by animals from the sides of the neck is valid, but milika cannot be done from the sides of the neck. Slaughter by animals at the nape is invalid, but it is valid by milika. Animal slaughter from the throat is valid, but it would be invalid by milika. This is as animal slaughter is done by the throat and milika is done by the nape, and you cannot do this the other way around. The Gemara defines the word for nape, and it brings sources. During the process of milika, the Kohen uses his fingers to shift the neck pipes to the back of the neck, so only those get severed. It's debated if this was optional or a required step. That's discussed. It's also said that milika should be one straight motion, so it's debated if moving the thumb back and forth would invalidate the slaughter. It implies that it would not be valid. Some say that anywhere on the neck that's exactly opposite where the animal is slaughtered is where milika could be done. This is to invalidate milika done above the permitted area by the head, but angled down so that way it went into the neck. This is the same principle as mentioned earlier by an animal, that a cut a third too high and 2/3 in the permitted area is invalid. Related, there's a dispute as to whether slaughter of a bird that's neck pipes were dislocated is permissible, based on whether the proper slaughter of a bird is a principle of rabbinic or biblical law. That's a disputed point. Additionally, it's said if an animal's neck bone and most of the flesh is broken, is viewed as if it died without proper slaughter, not just as if it had a defect. The same principle existed in the middle of the earlier tractate, Zevachim, saying an offering bird slaughtered with a knife instead of milika is not considered to have been slaughtered. There's suggested reasons. Some say as the knife gets burrowed under the neck bone, others say because the knife only presses straight down without moving to the sides. They disagree based on what they hold is or is not an invalidating principle. According to this quoted opinion that an animal is considered dead once its neck bone and most of its flesh is broken, it's argued as to what the point of milika even is, as the pipes by the bird would be cut last in this case. It's explained that milika must be similar to ordinary slaughter and that these pipes too must be cut. Additionally, to make it that you're not just doing milika on a dead bird, the spine could be severed, but majority of the flesh cannot. It quotes some related points on a person with a similar severe neck injury as to how this would apply by laws of impurity. If an animal is split in two, it's automatically considered as if it was improperly slaughtered. The same would apply if the thigh bone and all of its flesh were removed up to the joint. There are further points on laws of impurity. There's a related quote regarding verses which compares the bird ola and the animal chatas offerings. This comparison teaches that the two have the same features in that they're only offered of consecrated animals, they're only offered by day, and the service is done with the right hand. By the bird ola offering, however, both pipes must be severed during milika. Others say, actually, the comparison is with the bird chatas, and it's to teach that milika is done by the nape by both. However, by the bird chatas, only the first pipe is cut, unlike by the ola. Others say the comparison is between a bird ola and a bird chatas to teach that the blood by both of these are sprayed as the head is still attached to the body. A question to the sources for all these. New Mishnah. Regarding bird offerings, what's done with turtle doves is not done with pigeons, and what's done with pigeons is not done with turtle doves. By both birds during the period of adulthood where their neck feathers turn yellow, they're invalid. The Gemara says, further, by turtle doves, they're valid as offerings when they're adults, while pigeons must be brought when they're young. Sources for these principles are quoted. It's also said that young pigeons are required, newborn pigeons were impermissible as offerings, and it defines these ages. Related, it's asked, what if somebody vows to bring an ola bird offering but brings birds within that stage where the feathers are yellowing, if that's permissible as to if it could be a questionable status? It said they're considered improper, as are birds used for bestiality or idol worship, which it quotes sources on. Similarly, if somebody vows to bring an ola offering of a ram or a lamb and brings a palgas, which is some animal that's possibly one of these or possibly a third category, it's debated and it remains unresolved. A similar dispute exists by somebody offering to bring a toda offering and then brings partially leavened bread, which again stands unresolved. New Mishnah. What's valid for the red heifer offering is invalid for the Egla Arufa ceremony, and what's valid for the Egla Arufa ceremony is invalid for the red heifer. The Gemara explains the red heifer is only valid if it's killed through slaughter, while the Egla Arufa is only valid if it's beheaded. Sources for this are quoted. New Mishnah. What's fit for Kohanim is unfit for Levium, and what's fit for Levium is unfit for Kohanim. The Gemara explains Kohanim can get disqualified by blemishes, while Levium are disqualified by age. Sources for this are quoted, and it discusses additionally defining these age limits. It also gives minimum age requirements for the service of Kohanim and Levium. New Mishnah. What's pure by earthenware utensils is impure by other utensils, and what's pure by other utensils is impure by earthenware utensils. The Gemara explains that if something impure is suspended even in the airspace of an earthenware utensil, it's impure, but if it touches only the exterior surface, it's pure. The inverse is applied by other utensils. Sources are quoted, and these are discussed. New Mishnah: what's pure by wooden utensils is impure by metal utensils, and what's pure by metal utensils is impure by wooden utensils. The Gemara explains unfinished wooden utensils are impure, while flat wooden utensils are pure. The inverse applies by metal utensils. Examples of unfinished wooden utensils are given. The same is done for metal utensils. Unadorned wooden utensils are considered complete, while unadorned metal utensils are considered incomplete, possibly as metal utensils are made for prestige, possibly as they're expensive. There's a practical difference between these by bone utensils, which were only expensive. New Mishnah: what's subject to tithing by bitter almonds is exempt by sweet almonds. The same applies vice versa. The Gemara explains, by bitter almonds, only sweet ones were subject to tithing, while sweet almonds have only the large ones be subject to tithing. Others disagree and say all small almonds are exempt. Those that say large bitter almonds can be tithed, as they can be sweetened to be considered like food. New Mishnah: unfermented grapeseed wine cannot be purchased with second tithe money, and it would disqualify a mikvah if it's poured into it. Fermented grapeseed wine can be purchased with second tithe money, and it does not disqualify a mikvah if poured in. Regarding brothers who are partners in owning their father's estate, they need to pay the additional kolban tax in addition to the half shekel, and they're exempt from the animal tithe. If they're obligated to pay the animal tithe, they're exempt from the kolban tax. The Gemara disputes who authored this based on individually held opinions. If further explains the principles of this grapeseed wine as to when it would disqualify a mikvah, along with principles of tithes. That's discussed. New Mishnah: so long as a girl is permitted to be sold by her father as a maidservant, there's no fine paid to her father by a violator or a seducer. If there is a fine, she cannot be sold. The Gemara says others disagree and say there would be a fine paid either way. New Mishnah: if a girl is refusing miyun, an arranged marriage, there's no eligibility for chalitza. If there's eligibility for chalitza, there's no miyun. The Gemara says this is just one opinion. Others say miyun can even be done when chalitza can be done. New Mishnah: whenever a holiday immediately precedes or follows a Shabbos, if there was a horn blast to announce the beginning of Shabbos, there would be no Havdalah service after Shabbos. If a holiday falls out on Shabbos Eve, the horn would be sounded, and there would be no Havdalah. If the holiday immediately follows Shabbos, we say Havdalah, but sound no horn. A specific Havdalah prayer is said to separate between Shabbos and a holiday, which is this. The Gemara explains how these horn blasts sounded, and further quotes the exact unique Havdalah prayer between Shabbos and a holiday. And that's the end of chapter 1.